Hello and welcome to Bridges Not Walls. I'm your host, Adrian Fabian.
And I'm your co-host, David Haratunian.
Today we have a special guest. Can you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
You need my full name?
No. Your first name's fine.
Okay, cool. Hi, my name's Cole. I'm a freshman, obviously, at Santa Cruz. I'm a history major. I like soccer, rugby, snowboarding, chilling. Look, I'm not the most interesting person, so...
That's fine. So this week's show is about the topics of immigration, identity, and culture. So let's begin with the topic of immigration. Could you explain your ethnic background to us?
Yeah, sure. So, both my parents are mixed. So, my mom's half white. My granddad's from Germany, and then her mom's Polynesian. So we're Maori, technically, on my mom's side. And then my dad is, English and Cuban. So I'm just all four of those.
Interesting. In terms of immigration, are you a first-generation American or international student or what?
I'm like 1.5 because my dad's first generation, but then my mom is also an immigrant, so it's like there's enough experience in my family living in the States, but also like my mom still had to, acclimate to like a totally different country.
Do you know how your parents came to the U.S.?
With my mom at least, she moved here in like the late 80s, early 90s with my older sister. Pretty much she had met a guy after her divorce in New Zealand. He was working as a flight attendant for Air New Zealand, but he was living in like Seal Beach at the time. So she had just decided she was like between jobs, wanted to change in pace. So she got a green card because they got married, and then she just, packed up her life and moved here.
And your dad's parents?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about my grandma. I think her family is from the States actually, so I think my dad's also in the same situation as me. Oh, okay. My granddad, at least, he moved here prior to the Revolution. He moved here in like the early 50s, so like right before. Mm-hmm. What happened was his dad worked for GE, and he was like the head of international sales. Mm. But they were obviously like headed in Cuba because my granddad's Cuban. That was what was comfortable. But GE needed him to move to Wisconsin or something. Somewhere completely like Midwest, full opposite of Havana. So they just packed up and left because they had to for job's sake.
Okay, so do you know if they encountered any difficulties while trying to come to the U.S., or did they like have smooth sailing?
I'm not too sure about my dad's side. My granddad, he never talked about it in like full detail. I'd say his biggest things were just with assimilation because he only spoke Spanish, and my whole family, totally different culture. So I think major culture shock. I remember my mom got detained in customs, but that was just because of the Rainbow Warrior incident in the 80s. So there was mild tension between.
What was that?
There's conflict between the U.S. and New Zealand because America had nuclear-powered ships that New Zealand would refuse to let dock. Oh, and then on top of that, France had bombed a Greenpeace ship right off the coast of New Zealand.
Wow.
It was nothing major. It was just like a minor spat, but it was going on at the time that my mom was trying to move here with my sister. So they're held up and they're questioned a bunch, and then they're just like, nothing too major.
So if you had the ability to change the immigration system that we know today, how would you change it to improve it?
To improve it, I would definitely make it much easier, especially for professionals to move to the States, and even then, non-professionals. A lot of, like, asylum granting and stuff. I know a lot of people argue, it'll let too many people into our country. But I think that it's a much more humanitarian focus compared to locking them up in, like, the internment camps we have right now. but then for professionals, I think being able to give people green cards will make the whole process much easier. Because I know a lot of people are on visa right now, and it's a complete crapshoot. So,
all right. So moving on to the topic of identity and culture, my co-host David likes to often bring up positionality. David, would you like to bring it up?
I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of positionality, but let me just remind the audience what it is. Positionality, as defined by Senso and D'Angelo, is the recognition that where you stand in relation to others in society shapes what you can see and understand about the world. So, after hearing that and your knowledge on positionality, how do you think that your position as a, let's call it, first and a half generation American, do you think that that plays a big role on your identity and how you view current issues and things in society?
I think it definitely plays a bit more of a role compared to someone who's like third or fourth generation who's like, oh, my family spans back to like the revolution or all that. I feel like there's a bit more of that traditionalism that comes with having family who's lived here for longer, because it's like, oh, we're, I don't know, whatever, true-blooded Americans or some load like that, where it's more of a defending that traditionality. Whereas, like, if you're already coming from a position where you got non-traditional parents and you're already living with a lot of different cultures in your household, but with, like, also this dominant American culture as well, I feel like it influences it. So it's like, I feel like I'm obviously more lenient towards that immigrant, like, position, because I'm sort of, like, if the immigration laws were tougher, I wouldn't exist, you know? My mom would probably still be living in New Zealand. My family would still be in Cuba. Like, without the immigration system itself, you know, like how we had quotas and everything back in, like, the 1930s. And even today, it's not a quota system per se, but it's like, there's way more of a limit on who can come in, who can get green cards. I feel like I would be more lenient towards a less harsh system, because without a system, I wouldn't exist, you know?
So would you say that for other people as well, this is common that their immigrant status, their ethnicity affects their determination of their identity, or is a big part in their formation of their identity?
You mean like if you like live here?
Well, I'm saying that a person's ethnicity or their status as like a first generation American or a second generation American, do you think that heavily influences people's formation of their identities? Oh yeah, for sure. I feel like culture per se here is it's a lot more of like I'd say defining factor, because, you know, America is known as like that one big melting pot. Like, we got so many different cultures and ethnicities who come here. Like, if we're back in the homeland, it's like, it's not really a question of like, oh, I am this or I am that. But living in America, it's like, you want to like keep and defend and maintain and discover your cultural background more, because it becomes like, oh, yes, I am an American, but obviously I'm not like full-blooded American. So I feel like it plays a much greater role, especially because we're such a country, especially in the modern era, I'd say, a country of a diverse range of immigrants. So it's like keeping that, and it becomes more present because you have to defend it much stronger than if you're just living where you normally live. So would you say that culture and ethnicity are two different things? Or would you say that they're interchangeable? That's a good question. I'd say that because culture doesn't necessarily have to be linked to ethnicity. I think it's like a square rectangle thing where culture can be linked to ethnicity, but we have like, you know, LGBT culture, different forms of culture, but culture usually is like, oh, I am Cuban, I am linked to Cuban culture. Oh, I'm from New Zealand, I'm linked to New Zealand culture. So would you say that ethnicity is a subgroup of culture? Yeah, I think so. I think
I mean, like, yes, you can belong to an ethnicity and have no connection to your culture. A lot of people have that, especially, like, if we're discussing, first-generation kids from, like, the 60s and 70s, there's way less of a connection to your culture, especially if you're growing up in a majority white area, like white Protestants.
Yeah.
A lot of it happened to my family, too, where it's... you have to... There's much more of a battle now for, like, my sister and my other family to defend... our culture compared to, like, when my dad was growing up, because it's like, assimilate or be excluded,
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was a total tangent to your question, but I do think
it's fine.
I do think that ethnicity is, like, a subset of general, like, culture.
No, you answered it. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stuart Hall, but for the audience, let me expand on the term othering, because it's going to come up in a couple questions. Othering is the practice of distancing different groups of people from each other to better define one's own identity. Have you personally ever been othered before, especially on this campus, if you can find an example?
I'm kind of a bad example. You can't see this because this is audio, but the two hosts can see this. I'm very white. Like, no, I got blue eyes. My skin is, like, it's not pale, but it's tan. Like, no one would ever question, like, I don't get stopped and frisked like a lot of other, like my granddad would, for example. 'Cause, you look like, the general American stereotype of the white man, whatever. So, for me, it's like, I don't have to deal with that, but then I also feel kind of bad, because it's like, I know a lot of, like, my compatriots have to, and it's like, that's kind of unfair that I don't have to, but they have to,
Do you feel that rather than othering people, we as a society and as a school should focus more on similarities between different groups?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think that in the general context of it, it's all about the balance of, like, we gotta respect each other's ethnicities and each other's culture. You should be proud of, like, even though you didn't work for it or anything, it's like, you can't change that part of you. It's part of who you are. And we should embrace our cultural differences and our diversity. But then at the same time, we should also realize that respecting and embracing that culture doesn't mean that we have to divide ourselves and exclude other people. It's about finding that balance between, what makes us different, but then unifying as a group. Because on this campus, like, we're all here to get our degrees and to have a good time. We shouldn't be excluding people, because you look this way or you're this ethnicity,
So we should build bridges instead of walls is what you're saying.
If the name of this podcast is correct, yes. For sure. I think that, people who are trying to build walls in this country are only detrimenting it, because the future of this country isn't all white, There's too many of us for it to be all white.
Mm-hmm.
And there's too many different people, like mixed race people are just going up in, like, demographics, so can't stop it.
Well, on that note, Cole, thank you for joining us today. That was a very pleasant experience.
I hope so.
Good luck with your studies.
Oh, thanks.